Absolutely.
Yeah. So, so how you been doing? You're starting podcasting. I saw that you did the roundtable event, and I saw you guys afterwards. You were recording out on the street in Singapore.
Well, we did. We were. What happened was that we had dinner. Well, we didn't have dinner. We had the event and we had dinner, and then it kind of like by the time we actually finished the whole event, it was run about like past 10 p.m. So everybody was pretty much starving.
Now, was that event live streamed? Did you live stream that event?
We wanted to live stream, but I think the sound system wasn't capturing everything well balanced. So what we ended up doing is that we recorded it. I don't have the best version because we have 3 cameras around the room. The one that I using my phone was way at the back. I need to get the files for the other rooms, for the other angles. I think the other 2 angles were closer to the event, to the speakers. Okay. So I will get that, and then I will see how to upload it because it's a 3 gigabyte file. It's huge.
Now, are you planning to upload that to like YouTube, or are you going to make a iTunes podcast, or what are you planning on doing?
It depends on the quality of the recording, because we recorded it also using a professional video sound system. But according to what they were saying is that it was very imbalanced. Like the microphones weren't capturing the sound well. We'll see. I don't know. Most likely is that when I get the raw file by later today, I might have to I do some editing, like just cut out bits and pieces, because there were sections that kind of, when you're on the set, it's very different when you listen to podcasts, right? Once it becomes a bit boring, then people kind of just tune off. So we don't want that to happen. Most likely I will be editing bits and pieces of it out.
Okay. All right. Well, we don't want to talk too much. We want to save all of your stories for the interview. So,
okay.
So as you know, I've launched a podcast that's now published on iTunes. It's called the China Leadership Dilemma Podcast.
Yep.
And the main thing that, obviously, by being a guest on the show, when we promote this episode, this will go out on all of my Facebook groups, social media channels. I'm going to make the image that I told you. That's the kind of promotional image. And then obviously you and Hungry Labs will be able to use that to kind of do your own cross promotions. The key for me is really to let my audience get to know some people who have very diverse and interesting cross-cultural experiences. And you certainly fit that category. And my niche also really focused more on business side, not just personal side. You go to China for vacation, how do you order food? That's not what I'm talking about.
It's like a spring break for 3 weeks and then come back and say they're multicultural.
Yeah. So I'm more into the cultural differences that business people may encounter when they work in different cultures. And you have so we want to really talk about your experience in, was it Brazil?
Latin America, yeah.
Latin
Brazil
America.
And Paraguay.
Brazil and Paraguay. And then obviously you were born and raised in Taiwan.
No, I was born in Taiwan, but I was never raised in Taiwan.
You were born in Taiwan and raised in Latin America. Okay, so anyway, so we're going to, when I do the introduction, I'm going to do a very brief introduction to you as the co-founder and CEO of the Hungry Labs Asia, based in Singapore, and also you're the co-host of the Asia Tech Podcast, which is something I assume that you are now just getting ready to launch. Have you launched it yet, or are you developing it?
We did 2 episodes, which are already up there, but like I'm not openly publicizing it. Like we talk about it during the event, but it's because it's only 2 episodes. It's more like a practice thing. But it's already up there on iTunes and on some of the podcast channels.
Okay, so
did I send you the link?
No, you haven't. But basically, I'll just say that you're developing or co-host of the a new Asia Tech podcast. And then you can kind of maybe even get into how it's developing. Yeah, because I have, I didn't officially launch my podcast until I had 8 episodes.
Yeah.
So yeah.
We
So
can't say that we've launched it. Like we've just treating it as practice.
Okay. All right. So yeah. So do you have any questions about? We're going to try to go for about 40 to 45 minutes.
Sure.
It just really depends on the conversation. This show is really about you and your experience. I'm going to try to talk as little as possible. I may share a little bit when I talk about certain aspects of your experience and how it relates back to me. But for the most part, it's really about you sharing your experience. Sure. As a business person, as a multicultural person, as you call yourself a global citizen, and also, just your experiences working in different countries and different cultures, and do you experience prejudices or cultural biases? How do you overcome those? Do people immediately assume that you're a certain thing? I mean, any of those stories, especially if, they ended up affecting you, those would be really interesting. So that's what we're going to get into. Sure.
I have a ton of those kind of stories, by the way.
Then this could go quite a long time. So do you have any more questions before we start it? What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a quick introduction. I'm going to do a quick introduction of you, and then I'm going to ask you kind of just a very simple question to tell us, where you were born and raised, and we'll just go from there.
Sure. Are you experiencing lag on your side? Because I'm kind of experiencing bits and pieces of lag.
No, it's pretty good on here. The video quality is good. Yeah, and the sound quality too.
Okay, as long as that's fine. Because for some reason here, like a couple of times when you were talking, there was a slight lag.
Okay, and then just also let you know, the before and after the official recording, I'm recording already. So that'll be a behind the scenes that goes out on my YouTube channel, which gives me another social media link to kind of cross promote. So when people will link to the podcast and can go from the podcast to the YouTube channel, and it's part of the cross promotion strategy to just get everybody more engaged.
So my understanding is that you don't edit your podcast, right?
No, everything is kind of like live. I don't do any editing. I don't do any cuts. The goal for me is to just be really kind of unscripted. We want to be as authentic as possible. So people just really want to know who you are. You can even cry if you want.
I try to squeeze some tears.
Okay. So so that's basically the format of my show. And actually I interviewed a guest in Geneva, Switzerland, and he also has a podcast. So he actually pitched me to come on my show. Wow. And he was really concerned about the video and the free talk before and after, because he wants to maintain a really kind of professional image. And maybe during the before and after we get into more personal things, or he's uncomfortable with video or whatever. So, some people are not comfortable with video. So I just wanted to make sure you're okay with that.
Yeah, I'm fine. I mean, I just did an event 2 days ago and that was fully recorded. So yeah, that was on video.
Okay, so if you are ready, I'm going to go ahead and do my introduction, and then I'll start you off with a kind of very simple icebreaker question.
Sure.
Welcome to the China Leadership Dilemma podcast, where once upon a time I thought being in the 1% of 1% would be sufficient to crush it in China. But lack of awareness and empathy caused me to experience several unexpected disappointments that we now call CLDs, or China Leadership Dilemmas. Today, my guest is Gustavo Liu, or we just call him Gus for short. He has an extremely interesting story. He's the co-founder and CEO of the Hungry Labs Asia, which helps startup companies. It's based in Singapore. He's also the co-host of a new podcast called the Asia Tech Podcast. He was born in Taiwan, but he was raised in Latin America. And he was educated in the US and in the United Kingdom. He speaks 5 languages fluently as he travels all around the world. He speaks English, Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin, Chinese, and Taiwanese. And I met Gus last year at a WeWork, and sometimes we don't know whether we should speak English or speak Chinese, but we'll get into that later. So, Gus, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I've given everybody a brief introduction, but can you kind of just talk a little bit about where you were born and raised, where you currently call home, and maybe which language and culture you feel you most affiliate yourself with?
I think that's one of the most common questions that I get, because when you are raised in different parts and different cultures in the world, people want to know, like, what do you think? In what language do you think in your head, right? Like, what do you write? So, I mean, to start off with your first question, I was born in Taiwan, but at the age of 5, my family immigrated to Latin America, and I've been there in between the borders of Brazil for over 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, like, education, because of the society and the safety reasons, a lot of kids that grew up there eventually went to study over either in the United States or in England or back in Asia. In my case, is that I went to study in the UK, and that's where I picked up English and everything. I would say that in answer to the second question, what language do I associate mostly to? I would say professionally, I use English the most. A lot of the terms in terms of Chinese wise, I do use it quite frequently, but it wouldn't be a natural language that I think of. And then Brazilian, Portuguese, and Spanish is probably the second right after English, because that's the language that I grew up.
Now, did you go through any of the school systems in Latin America?
Yeah, actually, it's really funny because as Taiwanese, growing up in the Taiwanese community in Latin America, we actually had to go to school at 6, 7 a.m. in the morning to a local Brazilian school. And then as soon as the classes ended, all the Taiwanese kids would be sort of grouped together in a bus and taken across the border into Paraguay, where they have a Chinese Mandarin / mathematics. For some reason, the Taiwanese community felt like mathematics was far more important than any other subject. So those were the 2 courses, Mandarin Chinese and mathematics, that we had to do in the afternoon in Paraguay.
So did you learn your multiplication tables in Chinese or Taiwanese?
In Chinese, yeah. Funny enough, even though we had math in the daytime in Brazil, right? You still had to learn math, more advanced math in Chinese, which you find a very common trend. All of the Taiwanese kids that did study in Brazil at the time had very good grades for mathematics.
Okay, because I actually went to 1st and 2nd grade in Taiwan because my father took a 1-year sabbatical and he went to Taiwan University to teach physics. And so they pulled me out of the elementary school in the US, and then they put me, because I didn't have the basics, I had to start with 1st grade, even though my age was 3rd grade. And I learned mathematics also in Taiwan. So my multiplication tables, it's not 5 times 5 equals 25, it's 5 2. So that's how I can remember being in school, I would do my multiplication tables in Chinese because that's how I learned them in my head.
Did you learn using the little device, the little 算盘? How do you say that in English?
It's an abacus.
Yeah, abacus. Did you learn to use abacus?
No, I'm not that old.
I had to learn abacus because if you find that a lot of these cross-cultural families that go from Asia out into like the Western world, right? They actually kept a lot of that culture, which is kind of lost in the original country. So even though Taiwan kind of didn't emphasize that much on using abacus, the Taiwanese community in Brazil, actually in Paraguay, right? They actually did put a lot of emphasis on keeping the abacus culture.
So you can still use it?
No, I haven't used it in a long time. I learned it when I was very young. It did help to sort of, the whole point is this thing what we call in Chinese 心算, which is to a memory-based calculation. Literally you could be given 2 strings of numbers and multiply those 2 strings straight away using your head. And those strings can be extremely long. I never got to that stage, but the whole point of using abacus is so that you're essentially a computer. You have your head functions like a computer.
Oh, okay. Now, so where did you go to university? What country was that?
So high school was in the UK, right? You guys call it high school, but in the UK they call it A levels and O levels. And then I applied for a scholarship in the UK and didn't get it, but I got a scholarship in the US. And that's how I ended up in New York State, upstate New York. And that's where I did my undergrad.
Oh, okay. And what was your first job? What country was that in?
Well, I graduated with a double degree in mathematics and computer science, right? No surprise there. But then after that, I felt like I never really lived in Asia because my whole life was in Latin America. And I decided that around about that time was when my parents decided to get back to Taiwan. And, you know, it was a good time for me to go back and try it out. I went back and started sort of interviewing with some of the companies. And my first job was actually servicing the sort of European and Latin American clients for selling uninterruptible power supplies.
So your first job was in Taiwan with the Taiwanese?
Yeah.
Okay.
With a Taiwanese company, yeah, selling IT equipment.
Yeah. So you had never really lived and worked in Taiwan prior to moving back to Taiwan and then all of a sudden working for a Taiwanese company. How did you find that first job in Taiwan? Did you culturally, was it difficult the way that the Taiwanese kind of managed people in that time period? I mean, was it very hierarchical? I mean, it's completely different than Latin America in the US, I can imagine.
Well, think about it like early 2000, right? This was a time when if you were applying for a job in, say, the US or the UK, if you show them your resume and it said that you had a master's degree or an undergrad degree, it would be, you are sort of like, you preferred, right? Like people like the fact that you had an undergrad degree and all that. But in Taiwan, the education system has been, and the career system has been so, placed so much importance on education that I wasn't the only one with an undergrad degree. Like there were millions of people out there. And back in the early 2000s, the economy wasn't, was just sort of doing okay, but it wasn't doing well. And Taiwan was sort of in the midst of, after Hong Kong went back to China in late 90s, right? The whole political tension between China and Taiwan was there. And so a lot of Taiwan, the economy wasn't doing so well. And a lot of Taiwanese kids that graduated from school were out of job and they were looking for, similar type of positions. And so I remember going into an interview and I said, well, I have an undergrad from the US, and he pointed at the table and there was a stack of resumes. And he's like, there was a big stack of resumes and he said, this is all the undergrad. And then the next year it was like half of that stuff, but still pretty thick. And it's like, this is all the people that had masters and went to study in the Western world and now are looking for jobs here in Taiwan. So it was really quite competitive. But again, Taiwan relied a lot of connections. So my first job was through connections.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about is, first of all, is the management. How was the Taiwanese management compared to your expectations? Because you didn't grow up in Taiwan. And I was just wondering how similar Taiwan is to mainland China, where there's a lot of, it's like you said, connections. Y'all call guanxi, it's based on guanxi connections. A lot of job offers are based on having guanxi connections. And I think you kind of mentioned that, but also succeeding So how long were you in that first job?
For about a year and a half.
Did you ever get promoted within that job?
I didn't get to the point where I got promoted before I left. I just felt that, like you said, right? Asian culture is extremely, there's a lot of emphasis on 关系. Right. And this aspect was a bit hard for me to understand. Of course, I mean, growing up in a Taiwanese family, a Taiwanese community back in Latin America, there was all the aspect of 关系. But academically, I was educated under a very Western system, right? Even during my internship years, it was through like Western companies in the US. So it was a lot about your capabilities and assessments about yourself as an individual and your skill sets, right? Even though I have to say that back in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a little bit of, because you were Asian in those countries, the opportunities wasn't exactly equal.
You're talking about like if you wanted to find a job in the US after you graduated.
If you want to find a job not so much in the US, but back in UK, for example, you did see a little bit of comparison there. In terms of the fact that you are Asian, you're not from that region, and that a lot of things were questioned far more than if they were to interview somebody equally that was native from England, for example.
So would you say that England is, or would you say that the US is a little bit more open to diversity than the UK?
Well, one thing I found about US when I got there in early 2000 was that Asians weren't actually the minority. Asians in the academic field were actually the majority. One of the they were on par with, we say, the whites. Can I say whites? Is that correct? Yeah, Caucasian. Because in Asia here we just call them white people, but I think in the US you guys have to call it Caucasian. To be politically correct. But the minorities were the Latinos and the African Americans, right? Or the blacks back then. Now I think the situation is much better. But if you looked at Asia, for example, I suddenly became the majority, right? I'm no longer compared to anybody. So here was I, for every interview that I went in Taiwan, I was compared equally to all of the other Taiwanese kids that were trying to get a job. And that is in relevance to my first job, right? So if you were to look at like a Western Caucasian person that came into Taiwan to fight for the same position, there is that bias that English might be able to bring their company to the next level, like that exposure. So maybe not so much now anymore, but back in the early 90s, in the 2000s, there was a bit of preference for, in certain positions for management positions to look at like the West.
So how about working in Taiwan? Did you have to do a lot of, I guess in Chinese it's called 应酬. Did you have to do a lot of socialized drinking with your colleagues, with your boss? Was that part of building guanxi relationships within the organization? And how did yeah.
Well, there's two aspects to it, right? You've got the part where I have to, you have the clients, because I was client facing. And so you have the clients, whenever the clients came into Taiwan, obviously we had to do the whole sort of entertainment and show them the culture and all that. It's all about giving them that Taiwanese experience so that they would end up buying the products. Then at the same time, Taiwanese organizations are highly political, especially when you're a small company, pleasing your boss, saving face, taking the blame sometimes, especially depending on your role. You have to take the blame for your boss. Who your colleagues are they more senior in terms of age? Even though your position is more senior, but if your age is younger, you might, that sensitivity of how you present yourself, how you talk and deal with things, right? You need to be very careful and aware of what kind of situation you're placing the other party. And this is something that is very different from, spending years in the West, where it's all about being direct and authentic and say things like you, because that is what people care for. But in Asia, none of that matters if you are unable to place your position and know where you stand in that organization.
Now in Taiwan, have you ever worked in mainland China?
Well, years later, after I left, I only stayed in Taiwan for about 3-4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And if the reason behind that is because I felt culturally as well as language-wise, it was very Chinese. It was very Asian, very Chinese, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wanted a platform that was more sort of international. And so in early 2007, that was when I had the opportunity to get into Singapore. And I've been in Singapore for the past 12 years. But long story short, is basically when I came to Singapore, my primary market that I was servicing in the banking industry was actually the Chinese-speaking offshore banking community. And that included China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. So yes, the long explanation to that was that I did have to service the Taiwanese as well as the Chinese business owners that were based in China.
Did you ever live in China, mainland China?
No, but I traveled quite frequently. Like I would say 2 to 3 trips, and every single one of those trips were about 4 to 7 days into different parts of China.
Yeah, because a lot of Westerners or Americans or Europeans, sometimes they don't know the history between China and Taiwan. And sometimes they don't even really understand the politics. But also the business culture is also quite different between Taiwanese and Chinese. My experience has always been that the Taiwanese business culture has a lot of Japanese influences. And I was wondering if you experienced any of that.
Absolutely. Like there's certain things in China culture, and having worked with China businessmen for over a decade, right? As well as Taiwanese businessmen, like you can definitely see the differences even today in 2018. I mean, let's not talk about the early 2000s because that was a whole different environment back then for China. But now 2018, you still see certain cultural differences. As you rightfully put it, for the Taiwanese, the hierarchical Japanese, which is you find a lot in Japanese or large organization, right? Your boss is always right. On a table, how is the seating arrangement is supposed to be placed, right? The most important guest sits on the right side. Did I get it right? On the right side of the dining table, right? Of the most important person of your organization. And then you, as the next most trusted person, you sit on the left side of your boss. So that kind of arrangement, and every time you meet somebody, you know, if it's hierarchical, you bow, right? In Taiwan, there is the handshake, but if you are dealing with equally Taiwanese government officials or business owners, that Japanese culture of how you sit, how you compose yourself, and some of the things that you talk there's a lot of Japanese influence.
Yeah, I think traditionally the Taiwanese sentiment towards Japanese is better than mainland China because obviously, you know, with the invasion and occupation and massacre in Nanjing, a lot of mainland Chinese people have a lot of negative sentiments towards Japanese people. And then oftentimes you'll see a backlash against Japanese cars and Japanese stores and Japanese restaurants in China whenever the Japanese prime minister does something provocative, like visits, you know, the shrine of the Japanese war dead or something like that. I think my experience is Taiwanese generally feel better about Japanese than mainland Chinese.
I would say that is yes, right. In general, I think in the early 2000s, because of the political situation, there was a lot of emphasis on trying to be the second Japan, right? Because they've seen how the Japanese economic miracle kind of went really high, later on collapsed, obviously. But then it was doing very well. So Taiwan tries to maintain a lot of those values that the Japanese sort of business culture had instilled in some of the organizations there. But I have to say that that has also, why I say that is a double-edged sword, because that is also what stopped the Taiwanese employees, as well as the Taiwanese sort of businesses from innovating and becoming creative and getting out of their comfort zone, right? It's always about staying in that company for like 30 years and then bringing your kids and then you retire in that company. Whereas for Singaporean companies or even a lot of Western companies, it's about bringing your skills to different parts of the organization. And you see a lot of executives jumping and bringing their teams around. And with that, not only do you acquire knowledge, but you also have to build yourself to adapt in that new organization. And as well as, think of different innovative ways to bring that company that you just joined to whole new levels, right? That almost doesn't happen. I'm generalizing here, but in Taiwan, you almost don't see that. Like that loyalty is what the Japanese organizations have instilled quite a lot. China, because it's a fairly new economy, right? I mean, we've only seen the economy sort of boom in the last 20 years. It's a lot more dynamic. You don't have that. You don't have anything holding you back. So, and also the government has been extremely proactive, encouraging businesses to go overseas to sort of cross collaborate with each other. I mean, you've seen companies like Tencent, Alibaba, and all of that. They've collaborated in a very large sort of range, right, of products. In Taiwan, you will see some of that, but not to the extent the Chinese have.
Okay. So, yeah, your first job after you graduated was in Taiwan. Have you ever gone back to, I know you're in Singapore now, have you ever done business in Latin America?
Well, Latin America has a very large Asian, well, I would say Taiwanese community. In the last 10 years, I think the Chinese, because of the Silk Road, the 一带一路 policy in China, they've actually gone in there quite aggressively. Like Huawei, for example, is everywhere in Brazil. But in early years of my banking experience, we've actually dealt with quite a lot of Taiwanese businessmen, and I helped some of those acquisitions to happen because Singapore was trying to become the second sort of Hong Kong of Asia in the banking. Today, they are already quite competitive, but back in the mid 2000s, that was when Singapore was, the financial system was up and coming and it was developing, taking shape, right? And I actually saw a very large opportunity that is very underserviced with the Taiwanese, as well as some of the Koreans and the Japanese that were in Latin America. And they had a lot of money, but they didn't know how to transfer the money out of Latin America. Just to give you an example, if you were making a wire transfer out of Brazil, the withholding taxes back then was already 27%, right? So they didn't want to. So a lot of Swiss bankers went there and they were poaching the Taiwanese community, the businessmen, the Taiwan Chamber of Commerce. And so I wanted that to happen with the Singapore banking industry as well. I mean, here we spoke Chinese fluently. This was a region where a lot of Taiwanese businessmen had to transit going back from Latin America into Taiwan. But there was very little people doing banking, using the banking system here. And so I wanted to, to answer your question is that I did go into Latin America. No, I didn't fly in there, but I had connections there that were able to make those sort of relationships happen.
Yeah, speaking of Singapore, now Singapore is really a diverse culture. When you're in Singapore, you live in Singapore, you call Singapore now your home. Are you a Singapore citizen now?
Yeah, I'm a Singaporean citizen now.
Okay, so when you're in Singapore, for just when you're working business, talking with colleagues, talking with business partners, what language do you use in Singapore?
Very good question. So it depends on what type of conversations we're having, right? And I have to say, it's very similar to a lot of the other Asian countries as well. If you look at like most of the Asian countries, including Indonesia, Malaysia, parts of China, Mandarin isn't really like the main language. And that is also the same case here. Professionally, Singapore, English is the main language. And that is the one that we use for negotiation and all of that. But if you are having a conversation with a businessman that has that is rooted here and has grown their business here, and they have very little need to expand beyond Asia, most of those conversations happen actually in Chinese, right?
Right.
Mandarin Chinese. There were several instances where I had to use Hokkien, and because I come from a Taiwanese background, we speak what we call Taiwanese. It's not exactly the same as Hokkien, but a comparison would be something like in Spanish, you would have Catalan and like the actual Spanish, right? What we call Castellano. So Castellano is different from Catalan. So in Taiwanese and Hokkien are two often compared to be similar sort of dialects, but they're not exactly the same. But it gets me by because Singaporeans actually do travel a lot to Taiwan and they like the Taiwanese Hokkien version.
Yeah, my experience in Singapore is a lot of the white collar professionals. Many of them are, I guess, what you would call overseas Chinese. They're Singaporeans, but their families immigrated from China, so they all speak Mandarin.
Yes.
So a lot of white collar professionals are actually of Chinese descent. So I ended up speaking Chinese in Singapore as much as English because most of my customers were Mandarin speaking.
Yes, I think if you were to compare anybody that was born before the 70s, and that's where the wealth is, right? Those people that were born prior to the 70s were the ones that experienced the entire economic boom of Singapore in the late 90s all the way to like mid 2007. And they actually are predominantly Chinese speaking. And that is what it was needed to do business, especially if you were in industries such as supermarkets, food, restaurants. Those were all things that you needed to be able to speak Chinese to deal and transact with people. Yeah. But I have to say, sorry, it's just to add on, Singapore has also Bahasa, which is Malay, and that is equally important as well. Like you need to be able to do business here, especially in the early 90s, be able to speak English, Chinese, and Bahasa. Like if you knew these three languages, it would get you quite far.
Yeah, something that I've experienced, I want to see if you've experienced something similar. When I used to do business in Singapore, so I started traveling to Singapore for business, I think in 1996. And all the way up through 2000 and I think 11 or 12, I was still traveling quite a lot to Singapore. Before Motorola was acquired by Google and then sold to Lenovo, I was doing a lot of business with Motorola, which had a lot of assets in Singapore. And one of the things that I noticed about myself, and this is what I want to hear about you, is when we're doing business in English, like we're in the conference room, we're talking English, but then if we're having lunch or we're having dinner, the conversation will switch to Chinese. And then I feel that it's not so much that it's kind of like I can make a deeper connection when I'm talking Chinese to a Chinese person, even though the Chinese is Singaporean and I'm American. And I also feel that when I think in Chinese, I can say things differently. And it's almost like what you just mentioned before. You don't have to worry about being politically correct if you're speaking in Chinese. But if you're speaking in English, you're thinking about, you're self-conscious and self-aware. Oh, can I call black people, or or something like that. Do you notice that you think differently? Your mentality is different when you're speaking a different language?
Absolutely. And this is one of the things that a lot of Western businessmen also call the expats when they come here. Although they come here and they marry local, like I know a couple of guys here that marry local wives, like Chinese wife or Singaporean wife. But yet they kind of still hang around within their own community, their own sort of expat, very wide, sort of very foreigner community. And what they don't understand is that a lot of, when you are actually in this culture, a lot of conversations happen in different languages that don't get translated, right? A simple example I would say is that if you say, if I compliment you, I would say, "Oh, Jin, you like if we went for business, I was like, you look more radiant today," and then you would probably say something like, "Oh, you're too kind," or something like that. Or you would say, "Oh, you compliment me back," or something. But then in Chinese, we actually say "nari nari," right? Which you can't translate directly. If you translate directly, it will be like where, right? You're asking for more details. But in Chinese, "nari nari" actually just means that you are being too generous with your words, if I could generalize it in that manner. But it's so hard to translate that kind of response, and you can only say it in Chinese. So in a similar thing is that when you, like the example that you said, in the daytime, we're having all of these very, which everybody's trying to break the ice and try to close a particular deal or try to come to a negotiation, right? But the real negotiation doesn't happen until much later when you, when everything kind of ends and then you go out for drinking, because that is when you are being assessed by the other party, whether he can deal with you and whether he can pull that string closer and get certain things that he weren't able to say during the daytime. So that a lot of people who do business miss out on that. They miss out on the after hours.
Yeah, I think that's an advantage that people like you and I have. I mean, we're experienced in the Western world. We have Western educations, but because we speak, we understand the local Asian culture, whether it's Taiwanese culture or Singaporean culture or Chinese culture, and we're fluent in the language, it helps us develop those closer relationships. And I think that works in both directions. I mean, when you're in the United States and you're talking with white people, your English, there's nothing wrong with your language, but you don't have as much of the American experience. Maybe you don't know how to play American football, for example. Have you ever experienced where it's harder to develop those close kind of guanxi relationships with British people or Caucasian Americans because of that?
Definitely. But I was also I was there in an era. I mean, let's not talk about like the recent time when we met in California, right? But like, this is years back when I was there. Like back then, there was always that segregation. It wasn't very clear. I can't really call it. They were being racist, or was I being like, it was something in my head. I can't really say that it was any of that because it wasn't spoken of. It just simply didn't feel like you fit in. And naturally, they didn't feel like you were part of that community because you didn't grow up there and your experiences were completely different. So I wouldn't say so much because of how I looked, but because of where I grew up, and I wasn't from there. I'm sure if there was an Asian kid that grew up in the UK and was born in the UK, he would be saying something very different from what I'm saying, right? But then he wouldn't be on this podcast talking about multiculturalism, right? but I mean, just going back to your question is that being in the US today, I definitely see that even though there is, the walls have been broken, and I can relate to people a lot closer, but it's still kind of different. And I would say equally, just to be fair, if a white guy came into Asia, like you ask them to go and join a bunch of like Chinese or or Singaporeans for a drink, they will feel as an outsider as well. That works equally. And it's not just people do it on purpose, but it's just unconsciously we tend to do that. For instance, I remember going to a meeting and bringing one of my friends. He was from, I think, was France, and we had a conversation. Everything was really good. The conversation went well, and then he was giving suggestions how things could be done better. After the meeting, I separately went out with my friend, the Singaporean guy, and then the first thing I asked him was, so how did you feel the meeting went? And his response was, he's great. He brings all the view, but he doesn't understand how we work.
Right.
So you see what that in itself, I think, just me seeing this phrase, I think some of your listeners in the US might hear this and might say, okay, maybe they don't understand the culture, they don't understand, the people there, or he was making suggestions of that. But you and I know that when you hear in Chinese, 他不懂我们的作风, like, that it's far beyond that. It's all about it's all down to there's a bit of racism there. There's a bit of the fact that he's white. There's a bit of the fact that he is, he just, there's nothing he could say. Even he lived here for 30 years and if he knew the culture, there's nothing he could have said that would have made things, that outcome different.
Yeah, that's just a natural cultural bias that people have. So like in mainland China, the Chinese people say, 外国人不了解中国的国情. It's basically saying exactly the same thing, which is fine. Americans may think exactly the same thing. The advice that I always give, it works equally well going in both directions. And
absolutely.
And the question is, like, for Chinese people or Asians who say that you don't really quite understand our values and our business culture, which is how that translates. The question is, why would you expect them to? Because what most Asians, especially, I've noticed a lot of mainland Chinese people, because my wife is from mainland China. I have a lot of mainland Chinese friends. So I don't want to stereotype them, but it's perfectly normal for them to think that, okay, foreigners coming to China, you have to understand how we do business in China. That's fine. The problem is when Chinese leave China, they don't change the mentality and say, okay, I need to understand how to do business in the US. They try to almost impose their Chinese mindset naturally in any business situation. And that's where the negative cultural biases come in. And I can tell you as an American, there are a lot of cultural biases against mainland Chinese people. And I'm empathetic to where they come from. And then I always have to tell my American clients or colleagues that you can't judge Chinese people for that. It's cultural. And if you try to judge people for their system of values, it's really going to cause you a lot of difficulties to be successful in business. But the thing is, it works in both directions. So that same advice goes to Chinese people.
Well, can I pose a different angle, right?
Absolutely.
Let's say, I just want to, taking it more from a neutral point of view, because I live in Singapore and been here dealing with ultra high net worth clients for the past 12 years. We've worked with clients in Asia as well as clients from the West.
Right.
And these are all people with money. So from my experience, I would say that historical change has sort of evolved, right? And I think China will eventually evolve into a very different China that we know today. And why am I saying that? It's because the US went through that period as well. Look at the US back in the 50s, in the 60s, that was, or even let's go even further. In the early 20s, in the 1900s, US was the Wild Wild West period, right? They went through that entire economic boom, and then they started expanding across the world. And they actually went into other countries with that mentality that everybody has to do our way because the American dream is the American way. And so everybody do it our way, right? And then they came into Asia, they went into Taiwan, Thailand, even Singapore, China, with that mentality that everybody has to do it their way because Americans had money, right? Today, China, well, back in the in late 90s, early 2000s, China was sort of viewed like the Wild Wild West, right? Where everything you go in there is no regulation. Like you bring in anything that was proprietary, it will be copied. Like that would be. But what people don't understand is that China today is no longer as China in the early 2000s, 10 years ago, because China today has evolved so much. They are kind of like the guys with money, right? The wealthy Chinese going to other countries. And of course, the one that has more money shout the loudest, right? And they go into other parts of the world, you know, like there's this common perception that if they went into Europe, they would buy like 20 LV bags or just spend without even thinking or checking the quality. But they have money. And so why should it be done differently? That is the way that any country, I would argue, historically has done. Look at the UK. In the 1800s, during the Victorian era, when they started going to the US, everything has to be the British way, right? And then eventually it kind of just like evolved. So this trend is happening, and I would say right now it's happening to China. China is going to other countries, but eventually it will evolve. And I don't think there's anything wrong. I just think that
there isn't anything wrong. In fact, I agree with you 100%. So like when Westerners or Americans, they go to China. Now, when I say China, I'm talking about mainland China. What you said is exactly the point that Americans have to be aware of. And so when I'm critical of Americans or when I advise them, is they will judge the situation in China at this moment in time. For example, if they have difficulty dealing with the government bureaucracy to get a license, or if there's somebody who is infringing on their intellectual property, whatever it is, they tend to judge what is going on in the moment. And I always advise my Western clients or students or colleagues that you always have to look at the trends, because what you talked about is the trends is what matters. How is China trending? So let's just talk about China for a second. Does China have laws that protect theft of intellectual property? Yes. Now, how well are those laws enforced? Well, they're not enforced very well, but the trend is they're being enforced more and more. So China's trending in the right direction because more and more Chinese companies now need their intellectual property protected. So as that trend happens where more China innovation is coming on board and Chinese companies care more about their IP because now they've developed their own IP, the trend is the China system of regulation is going to become more robust. The institutions that we all value in the United States, we always say the United States has much stronger institutions. People in the US obey laws, people in China obey people. Yes, in a static moment of time, that might be true, but the trend in China is evolving so quick, as you said, that people cannot judge China for any particular thing. They have to look at the trends.
Well, just to add on to that, I would say that what you said was at this point in time, right? But also they're judging based on their understanding and value system of what they've been accustomed to in the US and in Europe, right?
Yep.
What the danger of that is that if you don't fully understand the Asian mentality and you want to come to Asia, get business, get money from Asia, then that won't work.
That's right.
You need to adapt. And that's one of the things. Everybody in the West is becoming, I'm generalizing the majority of the way, when they start to deal with Asia, they assume that things have to be done a particular way. I have a perfect example of this. Just last month, I was at a pitch at one of the talks, and it was like probably the third meeting that these auditors and banks were having with a startup from the UK, right? And this particular startup came to Singapore, walked into the room, and started lecturing. So this is the thing. A lot of things that I said about, culture and about thing, you cannot, you could read as much as you want, but down to the basis, the fundamental is one single word: respect.
Right.
Or maybe humility. Humility and respect go hand in hand. So as entrepreneurs, I understand that you need to have that drive. VCs in the West, they want to see that you are very direct. You have the sassiness, the power. But when you come to Asia and you are asking people to invest in you and you behave in that manner, you have a lot of challenges and a lot of problems. So back to that particular example, this founder walked into the room, and this is all like the banks, the head of a lot of some of the banks that were thinking about investing into this fintech. And he was saying, how come the regulatory framework here can't support something like in an app? You guys clearly need this. And why can't you just get this law passed on? And why is it that I can't go into details because some of this is NDA protected, but you're just saying, why can't some of these technology can be implemented in your bank and all that? And at the end of his speech, one of the head of one of the banks here, is quite a prominent local bank here, just said, young man, I understand that you have been working in this company for a long time and you've been trying to get funding and you've had a very good traction, but you don't ever think that you can come here and tell us when your government your banks and your institutions needed to be bailed out by your government, when our banks, our institutions didn't need to draw a single cent or didn't need any help from the money from the tax-paying community here. And so somewhere along those lines, but basically that was his indirect way of telling him that you need to watch out how that whole humility when you're talking to people here in Asia, regardless of what stature they are.
That's an excellent example. That's a great example. I mean, that's exactly the mistake that foreigners make when they go to any different country or different culture, but specifically when they go to Asia or when they go to China, and especially when they're coming from Western cultures where the mindset traditionally may be, okay, we're kind of maybe consciously or subconsciously, people from the US or people from Britain may think they're superior to the Asians. I'm not saying they're prejudiced.
Do you think if the coins were flipped, if an Asian entrepreneur founder walked into a room in the US, full of like banks and investors looking to invest in them, and he was using the Asian way, which is a very, very sort of shy, and I mean, there is obviously as founders, we need to know how to pitch, but it's not as aggressive as the Western world. Do you think he would have had less of an opportunity in the West?
Well, I'm going to answer that question two ways. So Asian is a very broad general term. So it's hard to give advice specifically for Asians. But like, for example, I think a lot of Chinese in like Taiwan and Southeast Asia, they've adopted a lot of kind of what you say is important, a lot of being humble, having humility, maybe even being low key. Now, the assumption is that might not work for a venture capitalist in the US. Now, let me give an example. And again, I'm not being prejudiced, but somebody from mainland China may go into that same situation. And what they will do is they will do exactly the mistake that the guy from England did when he came to Singapore. And that's basically try to lecture the Americans on how we do things in China. In China, this works. In China, Alibaba is now the most powerful company, blah, 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 blah. And they'll cite success of Chinese companies as examples of why certain regulations and rules in America should be abolished. And so what the advice that I give applies both to Chinese going to the US and in your case, the British guy going to Singapore. And that is, you should leave things that are out of your control out of the discussion. Which means that if the country at a macro level has rules and regulations that have not been changed, and you're talking to investors, it's not a political arena where you can try to lobby them to make political change to regulations in the banking industry. So you've basically taken your conversation, which should be you pitching your idea, your management team, and why your business can make 20x or 100x return and have an exit strategy. You've changed the conversation to a political one.
Yeah,
because
there's a sensitive topic you don't want to get into.
Well, it's not just it's a sensitive topic. It's from the perspective of why you're there, making a pitch, looking for investors. That conversation is irrelevant, right? I mean, yes, you shouldn't talk about politics. You shouldn't talk about religion. You shouldn't talk about certain things because of the political sensitivities. But in a business environment, talking about regulations that are different in one country to another, and in a banking system that is not as well developed in one country versus another, that's just stupid. Because it's irrelevant.
Comparing, right, is not so good, especially when you are not your basis of comparison is not, you don't fully understand the local system to be in the position to compare.
I just say that the comparison is irrelevant. I mean, what does it matter, right? You're going to Singapore from the British guy's point of view. You're going to Singapore, you're looking for investors. Who cares if the system is corrupt and it doesn't work? As long as they give you the money, that's what your goal is. So you're distracting from your business goal by injecting your emotions into it. You have strong feelings about the regulatory environment or the banking system in Singapore. You don't think that's conducive to the app or technology that you're trying to launch, and it may not work well because of the macro environment. That's all irrelevant. That's the word that I use. I mean, you use the word that you have to be humble and you have to be respectful. Well, yes, that's what you want to project. But your mindset is you have to understand what's relevant and what's not. And as a startup company pitching investors, you really have to understand, and I use the word empathy. You have to be empathetic to the people that you are pitching. If you're pitching Singaporean bankers who are well-known, well-established in Asia, there is no need to criticize the system, because that ultimately is not going to win you the trust of somebody who's going to invest in you.
Well, that was one example, right? It's not that everybody right, but it's not everybody who comes here like that. I was just using it as a basis of what the mentality of people going cross borders, and it's just something that struck in the back of my mind when you asked me about whether like this cross cultural.
That's a great example. That's the excellent example, and the advice that I always give. So it works in both directions. Yeah. So you as a Singaporean or an Asian, when these people came over here, in the back of your mind, you're like, oh God, this guy is just really blowing it for himself. He's never going to win the trust of these potential investors. Well, if you're aware of how, the problem is that guy is not aware of how he's being perceived based on his actions and his words. But it works in both directions. So your question about when Asian companies go to the US and they pitch potential angel investors in Silicon Valley, are they aware of the culture and what they value? If they have that level of awareness and they're empathetic so that's why I think you're in a great position, because the Hungry Labs can prepare anybody to do that. Okay, you are now the co-founder of Hungry Labs Asia, but I know Hungry Labs here in the US. That's what they help startup companies do. They help them prepare the pitch deck. They help them prepare to do that pitch to investors. What do you need to pay attention to? What's important to talk about?
And we've also done quite a few of those cross-cultural pitches and cross-region introductions from investors in Asia to companies in the US, as well as companies investors in the US looking at investment opportunities here in Asia. So that, just to add on to what you were saying, that collaboration and talking to people who understand these sensitivities and know how to better position themselves, it's extremely important. So just exactly like what you said, right? Like, it's not just about just the Hungry Lab, but like, what kind of resources, what kind of connections are you able to establish before you go into that country?
Right.
The first move is just get out of your ass and move, just go, right? But once you go, establish some connections first. Understand the culture. Don't just try to walk into a meeting and assume that things is going to happen. Especially when there is just so much that is on the table and is unsaid. Everybody can see it, but nobody's gonna spell it out for you.
Yeah, I think that's why I think that's your experience. You're the perfect person to help. I hate to use the word, bridge this kind of cultural gap, but it's so important. And it's one of these things that people often overlook, how important the perception of your potential investors are. I mean, you can have a great business plan, a great pitch deck, and a great idea, but ultimately people invest in people. So if you show a complete lack of cultural awareness and understanding of the market that you are trying to enter, then people aren't going to trust that you're going to be able to succeed. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's why that's a great transition. So maybe you can talk about now a little bit about the Hungry Labs and what you're doing with that now in Singapore.
Well, with the Hungry Lab right now, I just opened the office about a month ago. We've managed to acquire about 3 startups right now, which are requiring some guidance. The interesting fact about Singapore is based on a study by the local universities. They've actually found that Singapore has a lot of what we call zombie companies. And which means that, and you don't see that happening in the US that much, because in the US, funding. I mean, there's a lot of zombie companies in the US, but the funding entity is a lot harder, because raising money is like a dog-eat-dog world, right? You're all competing for VC angel investors or go onto the crowdfunding platform. Whereas in places like Singapore, for example, you have one extra entity, which is the government funding a lot of this company, and the amounts can be quite substantial. And so sometimes the companies are funded because of self-interest by the funding entities, not so much about the potential of what that company is able to evolve into or the type of returns that are coming. To give you an example, for example, one of the major banks had given about 120K to a small marketing advertisement company that went up to pitch. And later on, we privately I had a private conversation with one of the VC guys, and they said, oh, the only reason why we picked them is because they were able to get us that exposure that we were funding on startups, but we don't think they're going to succeed anyways. So that is very damaging to the entire ecosystem, because that kind of situation is when these companies like that, and you don't believe in them, right? So this is one of the reasons why a lot of our advisory doesn't only come only on the startup level, but also goes on the investor level, is that you need to see how much, what are you value adding besides money? It's easy for you to throw money to that company and then hope that company will grow to its like multi-million valuation and then get a return out of that. But during that period in between of how do they get from 0 valuation to the multi-million valuation, that middle is really the execution that is really hard, and nobody wants to get involved in it, right? Like a lot of people that put in money, they just want to get it done. And that is the space that the Hungry Lab tackles. We talk to a lot of these startups, and before they even get to the point where they've already burned all their money, how do you strategize and work on that spending as well as that structure properly, so that you don't die too soon, or you don't end up wasting your money on places that you've received wrong advice on. And a lot of that work is just ongoing. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but we see a lot of that happening in Asia. The zombie companies, before they become zombie for too long, we want them to, know that building a business is hard, but you don't have to do it alone. There are resources out there in the ecosystem that you can tap on. And the Hungry Lab is one of the many resources. And if you don't know how to go about getting those resources, come and have a chat with us, and we'll be more than happy to just have a coffee.
Okay. How about the podcast that you are launching or developing, the Asia Tech Podcast? What is the real message that you want to give to your audience through that podcast?
So the Asian Tech Podcast is already an existing podcast. Is all over iTunes. They have various themes, various hosts, and me and my co-host Dennis Paul, he comes from more of a legal accounting background, whereas I come more from the advisory, management, strategy background, right? The finance background. And so together we are actually working on starting this podcast called The Start. And The Start essentially talks about various topics on challenges that founders face when they are trying to start a company. So the first topic was, for example, on how do starting up a company, what are some of the general sort of partnership challenges, right? The second episode that we did was on banking and jurisdiction. So if you are opening, especially in a place like Asia, where you could take a pick of any place you want, whichever country you want to start your company and open a bank account, which one is the better choice and which is more suitable for you. So that was the second episode. And the third episode we went back and revisited the topic on the whole funding and founders dynamic, because it came out of a report saying, just recently published, saying that in the US, well, in the world, basically, the average age of founders was around 40. But when we had that discussion and I went to further research it, the average age of founders in Singapore, or successful founders, was actually 29 years old. So the age difference is a lot bigger. And so that sort of kicked off the conversation for our third episode. The next one we're doing, we're just preparing, but essentially we'll be recording a series of several episodes before we actually launch it.
Yeah, who's the main target audience for your podcast? Is it young Asian entrepreneurs, or is it foreign entrepreneurs who want to start companies in Asia? I mean, what is the main target audience that you are marketing this towards?
The general Asia Tech Podcast right now, if you listen to some of the episodes, you find that there's various different topics. The audience I'm generalizing in the sense that it's more looking at Western businesses coming into Asia, the opportunities that Asia is able to offer them. But that is the reason why the Start will have a slight different edge, because I'm Asian and Dennis is also a local Singaporean, right? And he's actually been raised and grew up here. So his legal background, his entire culture background, everything is based on a local point of view. And that perspective is especially targeting for the Asian community. There's a lot of talk about the opportunities that Asians will have. But actually the Singapore government in the past, actually 1 or 2 years, is very recent, they moved out from trying to attract businesses into Asia. They still do that, but now they're encouraging local businesses to go outside, to go and venture into other countries, not just Asia, but also into other regions. It's like very similar to what the Chinese government has done, encouraging businesses to go into Latin America, go into Europe. So with that, we're hoping to begin this conversation in the podcast that I co-host with Dennis, to see about some of the risks and opportunities that there are when businesses in Asia are trying to expand overseas.
Okay, so that's a lot. Starting a new company in Singapore, starting a podcast. What do you think? I mean, we're going to kind of try to wrap this up. It's already almost an hour, but what are kind of the main kind of mental, physical, and cultural challenges that you think that you really need to be aware of to help you succeed, and how are you addressing those?
Well, I will go back to what I said earlier: humility and keep an open mind. Those are the two things. And I don't just say that because I talk to startups and I see startups and entrepreneurs. But as you know, I've done that myself, right? I moved to the US 2 years ago, and I stayed there for about a year and a half, just purely immersing myself in the local business entrepreneurial community, talking to investors, talking to startup founders. This is during the process when we were co-founding the Hungry Lab. And now I decided to come back to Asia. So all of those things are I have to walk the talk. I have to know what it is like to move to a whole new country with 2 backpacks, right? And just not having that support system that you're accustomed to, that you're used to. So I would say the same thing, to keep. And the one thing that I kept in the back of my mind all this time was to be humble and to be respectful of other people's culture. Of course, I would end up in Tennessee or in, like, say, somewhere like Michigan, right? Where people are extremely conservative. They have a very different view in terms of the political point of view, as opposed to somebody who was from more liberal city in California, for example. But regardless of where I went, I didn't challenge those views, even though I came from somewhere that was from outside. We're seeing the US with a whole different lenses, right? But that ability to empathize with them, understand where they're coming from, was extremely important. So I would say the same thing. Because you come into Asia, just because Singapore seems to be more liberal than China, right, in certain aspects, it doesn't mean that you just have to impose your views. China might be a communist politically, as a communist country, but they are extremely liberal in many, many ways. So that ability to empathize and understand that these different cultures is extremely important. So those are the 2 words: humble and respectful.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up this podcast. The last question I always ask my guests, and I'm really, really curious what your answer is going to be, is who are some of your major influencers today? And where do you get your inspiration? Where do you get your motivation? Where do you get your knowledge? Do you follow anybody online? And can you share that with our audience?
So I'm a fanatic when it comes to podcasts, right? But if you go down to the core, who is my inspiration? And I would say, it might sound a little bit cliche, but my parents, right? Even though they came from a very different era, but they are my, I idolize them a lot because they left Taiwan in the 80s with nothing in their pocket, and they built a business empire on computer parts in Latin America. And that spirit of entrepreneurship, moving cross-culturally all the way from Asia to Latin America without speaking a single word of Spanish or Brazilian Portuguese, is something that is very inspiring to me. And all this while, like, creating the Hungry Lab, even in my previous businesses, moving across countries, I've always had my father and my mother their spirit and the way that I saw them fight through so many obstacles over the years during my younger years was what inspired me the most. Now, on the back of where I gather resources, I would say podcasts. I everywhere I go, I have podcasts that I listen to. I listen to quite a few of the channels from Gimlet Media. I think they have quite a few episodes that are extremely useful for startup entrepreneurs. And A16Z on the tech side, I get a lot of information. And then I also listen to quite a few of the podcasts that have more sort of financial economics related topics, like Goldman Sachs, for example, and some of the local channels here in Singapore.
Do you have any specific like influencer, like a Gary Vaynerchuk or a Tony Robbins, or I don't know? Is there anybody that is kind of your influencer, not inspiration, but like just influence, like somebody who you say, okay, that's how you need to do it?
I think we influence each other on many ways. I mean, because of the way I grew up, you know, I had to adapt to many cultures and different people all the time. I would say that, yeah, I could come up with a list, right? Like that I hung out with, but I would say that my influencer changes it changes as I meet different people that inspire me, right? For example, my co-founder Bian, she inspires me in many ways. She was on TEDx talk at the age of 29, and now she's extremely driven. She's very visionary, and she influenced me in many ways. I look at my parents, for example, they still influence me. I talk to my parents like privately at least once a week to get their feedback and their views on some of the stuff that I'm doing. And I also talk to several entrepreneurs. Many of the entrepreneurs inspire me a lot. There are young entrepreneurs that are of age 24 or younger, and there are also entrepreneurs that have been that are over 60, and they all share different point of views that influence me in how I conduct my advices, as well as how I run my business.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great advice for a lot of our listeners, because my view is a lot of people become too infatuated with any particular influencer, and basically what you're saying is you're authentic to who you are, and if somebody makes a positive impression on you, then you'll kind of learn inspiration from follow them. Yeah, so that's perfect. So I want to thank you very much for spending this over an hour with us here at the CLD Podcast, sharing your story. I think our audience learned a lot about not just doing business in China, but doing business in Asia and some of the mistakes that people can make going across cultures. So Gus, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you for this opportunity, Jin.
Yeah, and I will make sure when the podcast goes out that everybody knows how to get in touch with you. So I'm not going to ask you that now. We'll make sure they can connect with you on LinkedIn. They know your business webpage, and they can all get in touch with you. All right?
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Gus. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay. Thank you so much. How's your wife?
She's just texted me saying, can I come back home?
Okay. Well, I hope to catch up with you guys soon.
Are you coming back to the US anytime soon?
No major plans right now, because the focus is really to get the Hungry Lab ongoing. A lot of the events are going. Actually, Bian is arriving this Saturday, and so she's gonna be here for 2 months, and we're going to be keep rolling the Hungry Lab here.
2 months, wow.
2 months, yeah. So she's staying at my place, and we're going to see how to. There's a lot of opportunities here. Like I talked about the zombie companies here. So a lot of them are very lost. Like literally, I was like 2 weeks ago, I was at a TEDx event, and they were asking like if anybody had an opinion. And this kid I think he was like 30-year-old, he was saying that he's been running his company for 2 years now, selling Soylent. Are you familiar with Soylent? That sort of that shake, that soy milk shake thing brand. It's like a soy milk shake. Mm-hmm. Anyways, he's trying to start a company that is similar to Soylent here in Singapore, and he said that the word he used is he felt very alone. And that was where I said, you know, we're here. I mean, that's why the Hungry Lab is created, so that you don't have to feel alone. So building a business is hard, but you don't have to do it by yourself.
Okay. Are all of your podcasts, are they all live events, or do you do any one-on-one interviews like this?
All of them are interviews like this. They are one-to-one. I'll be inviting you to the one that is more about cross-cultural, but because we have a couple of topics down the pipeline, I need to see which one is that we are going to do cross-cultural. But I think I love that story that you shared about you going to like China, and like how some of the challenges that you went through by like specifically like, you know, was it one of the guys that you spoke that you went, I think one of the talks you said that you went with one of your colleagues and he just treated you as an outsider, somewhere along those lines. And so that part I wanted to, you know, this is actually a story that's coming out from an Asian going into an Asian country, right? Well, a lot of the interviews happen at the ATP. Is that ATP has about 200 episodes right now, and all of them are very focused on like Westerners, like white people coming into Asia and some of the challenges they face. But they don't see that a lot of the Asian businesses coming into Asia, going into China, are also facing quite a lot of backslash. Yeah. And so those are some of the topics that I wanted to share. Like for instance, Taiwanese businesses that went into China and were like completely wiped out, right? That is something that is very often seen as well. So people don't talk about us because Taiwan just isn't big enough to be of consideration. But for somebody like you, for example, who is from the US and then you came here, that you get to see a very different perspective.
Yeah, I partnered and did business with a lot of Taiwanese companies and individuals in mainland China. And yeah, there's a lot of cultural bias in China against Taiwanese. I mean, there's cultural biases against Koreans, against Japanese, against Americans. I mean, you just have to understand what they are and not be offended by them. Use it to your advantage, right? I mean, if you know that if I'm Japanese and I know that Chinese people have a negative opinion of Japanese in general because of history, then use that to your advantage because that's your knowledge. You understand what people think. And if you just make people feel good about their biases, then you can develop closer relationships. Anyway, we'll save a lot of that for someday in the future when you have me on your show.
Yeah, let me get to you on the schedule, and then we'll fix a date and a time.
Okay, well, say hello to B with me. I didn't realize she was going to Singapore. Yeah. So I don't even know if she knows we're having this conversation and you're going to be on my podcast, but I'm sure she's going to find out about it.
Okay, let me know when the recording's gone and I'll pass it along to her as well.
Yeah, I'll send you all the links and I'll even give you the link to the behind the scenes in case you want to clip anything and use it for your own promotions.
Sure, great.
All right.
Thanks, you so much. Thanks.
All right.
Okay.
Take care.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.